And welcome, welcome to Writers Read. Oh, breathe in and breathe out. And thank goodness we are gathered again. I've been using that phrase, thank goodness, lately, because we've got to find goodness and be with it somehow. The sequence of events here is, as you might suspect, number 1, poem. Number 2, Nancy will join us. And number 3, there's a little preface activity that the readers are going to participate in today, both Bob and Nancy Bardeen. And they were willing to come and back because they've read before. So let's start with a round of applause for coming back, Nancy and Bob. Okay, here we go. I don't think I realized that this poem would require memory. And we're all working on our memory. So see if I can remember the poem. I say a line, and you say a line. Right, right, right.
Right, right, right.
Until you get it right.
Until you get it right.
Then read aloud.
Then read aloud.
You'll draw a crowd.
You'll draw a crowd.
And bring us great delight.
And bring us great delight.
And here comes Nancy Bardeen. While she's coming up here, I'm going to explain the email that I sent to Bob and Nancy earlier this week. I said, would you please come today with the name of a book or an author who changed the way you think? And since then, you know, a lot of you know my random brain. Since then, I've discovered I could have continued that sentence. That changed the way you think about the world, or that changed the way you think about yourself. And then I said, Nancy, you better participate in this activity. So I go to my bookshelf and say, Nancy, what book would you choose? Well, I've decided every book can change the way you look at the world or you look at yourself. I just grabbed this book because it was close. It's Simon Ottenberg's book on Nigeria. And just since last Sunday or Saturday, I have heard Nigeria 2 or 3 times in the news. And I said, I want to know more. And this book changed my view of how I view Nigeria. So Nancy Bardeen, what do you have?
Well, when you posed that to me, first, I thought, I'm not used to.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. When you first proposed that, my first thought was, you want to read a book, you find a book that you want to read, and you start to read it, and you find out you don't want to read it. That's a book that changed your mind. But I know that's not what you had in mind, Nance. So I brought this one. It's The Island in the Center of the World. And you all know it. I hear people saying that. Yeah. It's a great book because it's about the Dutch settlement of Manhattan. Before all of the bad people came, the French, the English, and all these people. The Dutch were very nice. They didn't go around hurting the indigenous people. They just built a wall to keep them out. And that's Wall Street. And they really were. It made a capital that was multi-ethnic. The citizens valued a free trade, individual rights, and religious liberty. Yeah, they weren't pushing anything that other parts of the East Coast, as they were settled, were pushing. Religion in Massachusetts and slavery down, they were, and unfortunately they were then followed by the English, who obliterated this for $24. And that's about all the credit they gave to the Dutch. But with this book, you will find that much that went on.
Say the title one more time for us.
It's called The Island at the Center of the World. Russell Shorto. Russell Shorto.
Oh,
I'm
thank you,
happy to
Nancy.
lend it to anybody.
Wonderful. Thank you,
So
Nancy.
that's my piece.
Okay, and what have you brought to read?
Oh. Are you serious? Okay, what I'm bringing is about being an old person, because that's where I am. And so these are very varied pieces here, and I really don't have time. Well, anyway, and they all have something to do with being old. The first one here, I think, will make you think of maybe yourself. It's called, I chose this because it's good to read out loud. It has dialogue. The Gift. Miss Baldwin was not one to frighten easily, but lately, with her advancing years, she'd grown anxious. It wasn't so much her physical frailty, although she was feeling it today as she carefully picked her way, cane first, through the noisy Starbucks crowd to a little table in the corner. It was the forgetting that had really begun to bother her. This afternoon, for instance, just before she'd set off for the coffee shop, she'd spent half an hour hunting for her latest issue of the Retired Teachers Quarterly. She'd finally found it in her purse, where she'd stuffed it straight from the morning's mail. When she was younger, she was sure she would not have forgotten something like that. Now she set down her coffee mug and eased into a chair. She pulled her quarterly out onto the table and sat still a minute to catch her breath and survey the crowd. With their cell phones and their laptops, they were mostly young, 20 and 30-somethings, she guessed. In the years after she'd retired, she might well have encountered a familiar face or two in such a crowd. Former students often came up to greet her. Perhaps occasionally she'd forgotten a name, but she never forgot a face. Thank goodness the quarterly still ran acrostics. She'd added them to her schedule of mind-sharpening activities she assiduously pursued, crosswords and word jumbles from the morning paper, dinners in front of TV trying to beat the contestants on Jeopardy, and her weekly latte at Starbucks to keep up with the times. She always did puzzles in ink. She reached into her purse for her pen, but as she probed corners and zipper pockets, she grew agitated. Had she forgotten her pen, too? Suddenly the table shifted. A large figure lurched into the empty chair across from her. Excuse me. He had a rough, puffy face, an older man. His glance rested for a moment on the quarterly, then he looked up. I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is the only chair left in the place. Would you mind? Why, of course not. Miss Baldwin nodded and smiled, not knowing quite how to proceed with conversation. She clicked her pen and opened to the puzzle. Gradually, she became aware that he was staring at her. Did he consider her rude to take up space doing a puzzle there when it was so crowded? Nor was it exactly a place for old ladies. Why, I can't believe it, he exclaimed. It was Miss Baldwin's turn to stare. Hey, you were my favorite teacher. Miss Baldwin closed her quarterly and leaned forward for a better look at him. Yes, ma'am. Well, it's been a long time. Why, I'm afraid it has. Behind an uneasy frown, she was racking her brain. Who was he? He most certainly looked old enough to have been one of hers. You haven't changed a bit, he grinned. You know, a lot of us really liked you. You were like, well, you were special. I was. An ache of nostalgia gripped her. How much she loved them. But this one, she couldn't place him at all. She felt a chill. Was this the way it happened when your memory really started to? Of course, I was always such a troublemaker at your class. The troublemakers. They'd always been the ones she cared about the most. Why couldn't she remember? He leaned closer. You know, I've been a little down on my luck lately. Miss Baldwin became aware of a sour, mildewed smell coming from his coat sleeve. If you could spare a $5, I mean, just temporarily, for old time's sake. I can meet you right here, next week, and pay you back, miss. His voice trailed off. Miss Baldwin glanced thoughtfully at the cover of her quarterly, there on the table. It took her only a second. Miss Connolly? She supplied helpfully. Miss Connolly, sure, Miss Connolly. I mean, how could I forget? Miss Baldwin felt a wave of relief. No, it was more like elation wash over her. She reached into her purse, unzipped the little side pocket, and withdrew a bill. He took it. Miss Baldwin permitted herself a small, secret smile, quite certain now that she'd never seen it before, and she probably never would again. Maybe all those puzzles were doing their job after all. I'll pay you back, Miss Connolly. He stumbled hurriedly to his feet. Really, this isn't a gift. Oh, but it is. Miss Baldwin took a deep breath, her gentle smile etched in wrinkles. One you've given me. Really? An old teacher is always grateful she's not forgotten. Oh.
Would you turn up your mic?
Oh. Do you know how to turn it up? Did you turn it up?
It isn't.
Turn it up. Is it on?
She's taught me to turn it off and off.
Yeah.
Is it not?
It's
Am I not
pretty
shouting loud enough?
It's up. It's your New York voice.
You're not loud enough.
Yeah.
That's the first time in my life I've ever been told that.
You turned it off.
Yeah, that's a more focused sound. Okay. Is this coming through?
Oh,
Yeah. Okay.
Would you reread the punchline?
It's a pun. It's a double meaning. An old teacher's afraid she's not forgotten, and that she's not been forgotten by other people. That's two things to be grateful for. It's a double. Does that answer your question? Yeah, it's a double. The second one I wrote a few weeks ago down in California, and I think you'll relate to it. And the title is the first line, which is written in italics. It looks better on the page than when you're reading, but okay. So the title and first line is, "Oh, Celia, you're wearing that lovely silk blouse Jane Freeman used to wear so often." Among the 500 or so residents of the Mountain View senior community, such fleeting observations were seldom expressed aloud.
Any reminder of the inevitable future awaiting one there was brushed away by efforts at unflagging cheerfulness. In any case, Jane had departed some time before Celia and Bill moved in, and she'd bought the blouse. One's wait for the inevitable future at Mountain View did, however, contain pleasures. Every week, in a warmly lit basement, the community's Monday market displayed a wealth of departed resident inventory that had not been claimed in reasonable time by kin. The basement bounty included racks of clothing, china and furniture, desk accessories, kitchen equipment, leftover linens, and abandoned electronics of all kinds. Every Sunday afternoon, resident volunteers descended to attach bargain price tags and proceeded to hang, shelve, and otherwise arrange this continuing supply of intriguing merchandise. The next morning, the doors opened to resident shoppers, their visiting children and friends, and during their work breaks, Mountain View's staff. In the 2 years since Celia had lost Bill, she had striven to maintain a positive facade while coping with the endless arrangements a new widow faced. She distributed those of Bill's possessions that were desired by friends and relatives. Much of the rest she shared with Monday Market. What she would never part with were reminders of all she'd shared with Bill, piles of picture albums, mementos of their travels, pieces of jewelry he had given her. And for some reason she could not really explain, a few of his most handsome Nordstrom casual dress shirts. Her most favorite, one he had loved long ago, but still looking crisp, was a muted gray checkered plaid infused with small squares of softest rose and white. Was it because she'd spent so many years touching up shirt collars and plackets in that hour when she always ironed just before he arrived home from work or later in retirement from the gym? While she'd given most of his good clothing to Monday Market, she had held these few shirts back longest. Sometimes, when passing them in the back of the bedroom closet, she would pick up a sleeve and rub it against her cheek in a speechless communion. When she had, in a reckless effort at emotional rehabilitation, finally given the gray plaid one up to the market, she had ever since regretted it. Visiting the market those lonely months after Bill was gone, she averted her eyes as she passed the men's clothing section in fear of encountering something of Bill's that she'd abandoned there. Then she looked up one morning to see that handsome gray plaid shirt hanging in the front display. Her heart stopped. Could it really? Yes, it was. As if 2 years of emotional effort crumbled in one tidal wave of surrender to grief, she stared, then turned and with trembling shoulders walked numbly back to the kitchen section and feigned interest in a plastic container of potato feelers. She no longer had any desire to shop in the market that morning, nor even any memory of what she'd come for looking for. What filled her with dread was the necessity of passing by Bill's shirt again on the way out. She made her way back to the exit, steeling herself to look straight ahead past the men's section. Then her resolve gave way. She glanced toward the shirt. It was gone. Had someone bought it? She peered along the racks in front of the little dressing room. The men's section was empty except for a young woman she recognized as Sally, one of the sweet little waitresses from Mountain View's dining room. Sally was standing where Bill's shirt had hung. Just then, the dressing room door burst open and a young man appeared. "Oh, Charlie, it fits perfect," Sally cried. "You look so handsome." She rushed over and threw her arms around him. He grinned and then kissed her on the top of the head. Celia watched in shock. Sally made Charlie turn around once, then straightened the collar a bit. Oh, yes, that collar. Celia had always had to do that with Bill, too. That shirt really did look good on Charlie, though. Celia retreated to the front of the room and kept watching. They looked so happy. Sally was saying something about Bill's shirt being the perfect thing for Charlie to wear tomorrow night. No, not Bill's shirt. Charlie's shirt. Charlie ducked back in the dressing room, and emerging with the shirt over his arm, he and Sally proceeded toward the checkout. As Celia continued to watch them, a feeling of peace settled slowly through her. Now that the shirt had a future, it was as if her love for Bill had somehow merged with affection for them. Celia returned to her apartment, already planning to see Sally the next time she dined with friends down in the community restaurant. Saying nothing about the shirt, Celia would simply mention noticing Sally with a handsome young man down in the market, and see where the conversation led from there.
Nancy, can you hear me? You're such a writer. The two words you put together, speechless communion. Beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for that story.
You're very kind. Very nice. Nice audience. Okay, I don't know about this. Microphone. Sorry. Okay, I wrote this piece for submission to the Connecticut State Legislature to argue for the state to continue to support an institution which had been home to my brain-damaged brother for almost 60 years. Established after World War II, Southbury Training School had become one of the two best state institutions in the Northeast for mentally handicapped children. My parents moved to Connecticut for the express purpose of gaining admittance for my brother John, and this was accomplished in 1958. The parents of these children, and some of these parents had political connections, really cared for them. The school's cottages were nestled in some of Connecticut's most beautiful countryside. Some of the families set up a private foundation to supplement what the state didn't provide. During successive decades, as these state institutions fell out of favor in arguments for group homes being more humane, the parents of the most handicapped residents fought to keep the school open. It closed to new admissions in the 1980s. By 2015, with only several hundred residents remaining, the more humane argument was increasingly supplanted by efforts of high-end real estate developers to relieve the state of the school's beautiful property. Depending on our areas of interest, we foundation siblings, our parents were long gone, presented various arguments to the legislature, political, financial, historic, for keeping the school open. Since human interest fiction had been my line of work, I submitted this more emotional piece about what the school had meant to caring families all those years. The result was A Sister's Story. Today is Sunday, and it is a glorious, warm October afternoon. Again, I have come, as I have for over half a century, to visit my brother John at Southbury Training School. We are sitting together on an old swing in front of his cottage, and cottage staff has alerted me to watch for the wild turkeys sometimes visible in a meadow along the road winding down through the grounds. Birds seem to be the only sign of life today, though I can remember times long ago when sunny Sundays brought visiting families to happily picnic with loved ones out there on the grass. John is holding a musical baby toy, one of the little toys I always bring him in my carry-on. He's never learned how to press the buttons to start the music, but he seems to be holding on to it obligingly. I want to believe that perhaps he's affirming some awareness of my presence. He has never learned to speak, although the staff reports that he will occasionally react to hearing his name. The medical records say he has a mental age of 8 months. On his next birthday, he will be 70 years old. All we knew all those years ago was that John wasn't like other babies. He couldn't hold his head up without it wobbling, and when it came time to crawl, he couldn't. A dark shadow grew over our house, thick with unspoken words and anxious glances. Years passed, and he didn't walk or talk, and he still wore diapers. When he was 5 and I was 7, he went away to an institution. The doctors insisted that the move was necessary for the benefit of the family's normal children, which was me. I'd be lying if I said I remember feeling sad that John was gone. When I put back the pillows nice and straight on the living room sofa, it was a relief he wasn't there to hurl them back down on the floor again. It was nice without his senseless noises, disruptive behavior, and constant demands on our mother's attention. And if our mother always seemed to be crying inside, well, somehow, I just came to accept it as part of her personality. But at an age when I was learning you should never tell a lie, I found it disconcerting that my father unflinchingly answered yes when asked if I were his only child. Alternate Sundays and Wednesdays were visiting days at Staten Island's Willowbrook State School for the Retarded, an old converted veterans hospital. And I had to cut a lot of this because somebody called us unweaponized memoir. The only times I really thought about my brother was on those Wednesday evenings when my father and I ate dinner by ourselves because Mom, having spent the day with John on Staten Island, felt too sick to eat. When I was in high school, our family finally moved to Connecticut, and several years later, John was admitted to Southbury Training School, where he was finally taught to walk and where our mother could visit him often. After her death, I found among her things pins and certificates of appreciation attesting to her many volunteer efforts at the school. Those of you who may remember Ruth Eller, she volunteered for many, many years at that school. They want to close this place and scatter the remaining residents into group homes across Connecticut from this longtime community of caretakers who are skilled in meeting the needs of people like John. Living out in the community will and I'm going to cut here because it gets too long. And I've talked more about the worry of how he would fare in a group home, or how any of the ones that were still there that were so badly afflicted would manage in a new situation. And then I'll move back to present time. The afternoon is growing chill. It is, after all, October, and it is close to dinner time. Eating is one of John's simple pleasures. Chicken with vegetables is on the menu tonight. I already stopped by the kitchen, as I always do, to visit with the cottage cook. He is rightly proud of his cooking, and he will give me some in a cup to sample if I stay to keep John company while he eats. John's servings are always ground like baby food. His brain development is inadequate for safely handling solid food. I'm no longer strong enough to pivot him back into his wheelchair, but a staff member has signaled us that he will come and help. Tomorrow I will stop by to touch base with John's physician and then visit his day program. John has known. John has known his day program teacher for many years. She has grown genuinely fond of him. Whenever she teases him face to face to get his attention, he breaks into a smile. I think John and I are too old to start over. As the autumn of our lives deepens into winter, it is a daunting prospect to redo the decisions and commitments made long ago by others who have shaped our lives. John's vision is poor. I'm sorry he cannot see the purple shadows lengthening out there over the grounds of Southbury Training School, where the roads curve past brick cottages with their white trim, now emptying of those they sheltered for so long. And the good result of that was that...
Mike?
The good result from this was that the place is still open. The efforts of us in the foundation, the siblings' efforts, have so far borne fruit.
Oh, wonderful.
And so when I talked a few weeks ago to a foundation sibling there, she said they were down to 114 residents. So hopefully with the pandemic sort of mixing things up in Connecticut anyway, they'll just hang on to this place until they lose, everybody. So it turns out to be... also, when it was published, this was longer and it was submitted along with the others. When it was published, a Connecticut trustee took an interest in my brother, and he was placed in the best building in the institution. He got wonderful care there for the last 4 years of his life. I was so happy that, again, this effort here bore fruit personally, as well as for all of our other friends that are there. So it's
Oh,
a
my.
sad story. Sad story, but a
my.
good ending.
Oh, Nancy, thank you so much, dear heart.
I have one little one. Do I have another for half a page or not? No. I'll go.
Yeah. Come back.
I'll come back.
Oh,
my son
that's
said,
good.
"Don't read that one about baking cookies," because he was baking the cookies, that's why.
Oh, Nancy, would you please share your sweatshirt before you leave? Let's eat grandma, period. Let's eat, comma, grandma. Commas save lives. Nancy, thank you so much. That was wonderful, dear friend. That was a gift to all of us. A gift to all of us, Nancy. Thank you so much. There we go. And Bob Corwin, welcome to you.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, I need to take a big, deep breath. That was
That's a good idea.
a rich time, Nancy. Thank you so much. And Bob Corwin, you get to start out with an author or a book that kind of changed the way you view the world or view yourself.
Okay.
What are you going to say?
The writers that affected me, no one will have heard of until they read my thing.
That's okay.
when my mother died 25 years ago, I inherited stacks of old letters and diaries and so forth, going back 6 generations of my father's family in New England. And so I had these cartons in the basement, which I kind of avoided. And then Bev said about 10 years ago, you need to do something with this while you can. And so I would take a cluster of these letters down to the Roy Street Cafe down at Harvard and Broadway and Roy Street and get my cappuccino and start reading. And anyway, the writing was typically from women, missionaries' wives or school teachers or nurses in the for the Union Army, and the writing was almost throughout was beautiful. Well, I realized the first one, the missionary's wife, I mean, she was born more than half the way back to Shakespeare and grew up having memorized the King James Bible, and that's the way she talked. And anyway, so that was, it made the whole, it drew me into it, and so.
So that language almost became your language as you read those letters.
Yes, I'll never speak the same way.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to, but the well, the writing was beautiful just as a piece of writing. And then also you realize that you were getting into their lives. No, they didn't have all these distractions that we have, electronics and stuff. And also they were often alone, either near a battlefield or out on the wilderness and might never see their, and so they would pour their soul into these. Anyway, so I felt like
that's a real good connection.
That's the connection. So anyway, this is a chapter from halfway through my project, and it's in the 2 or 3 years leading up to the Civil War in this family in New Haven. And typically the outstanding people in each generation are women, because they, but the patriarch here, who was the preacher of the Center Church in New England, was important figure, so I refer to him, and also his what he was going through in preparing how to solve slavery and so forth.
Okay.
So there's a lot of that here.
Okay.
And this chapter is called Who Will Lead Us Now? The year 1858 saw the birth in February of Alice Mabel Bacon, Leonard Bacon's youngest daughter. Leonard Bacon is the patriarch and last child, and then a year and a half later, the death of his beloved but anguished sister, Delia Bacon, in September 1859. Brother Leonard had stood by Delia in love and support, if not acceptance, of her Shakespeare mission. She went down the rabbit hole of deciding that Shakespeare had not written Shakespeare. And anyway, the family came together in Delia's final days in Hartford, and yet these personal events were almost a relief, some diversion from the turmoil in his world outside the home. His country was spinning on toward the abyss of civil war. Delia left a legacy, the quest for women's education, and this baton would be carried forward by her niece, Alice Mabel Bacon, when she came of age. The legacy passed between two very different characters who would both advance women's right to know. Before her diversion to the Shakespeare quest, Delia Bacon broke new ground in women's prominence in her charismatic lectures on literature and history in the 1830s and 40s. She advanced the role of New England's women in education and thought and innovation in learning and teaching. Slender and attractive with long black hair when loosed from her bonnet, Delia had attracted romantic attention, but after a courting disappointment, her lecturing career had flourished when she committed to singlehood. Leonard Bacon was born in 1802, 9 years before his younger sister Delia. They were missionary children on the Ohio frontier in a household impoverished, but for their mother Alice, who never failed in her love for them. Alice, navigated by a benevolent but demanding God, who expected of her that her children, Leonard and Delia, would grow in faith in God's high expectations. Leonard's church. Shouts and musket fire rattled up from the harbor. Now in 1858, when he passed this way, the center of New Haven Green, the sounds returned, imbibed from veterans' tales of 1779. The militia had mustered here to defend the town. Survivors were at his first service in 1825, inaugural of his career. The porticoed temple of Center Church had been 10 years built to be Connecticut's most prestigious. When the war broke out, New Haven sent 3 companies to Washington's army, with more enlisted later. This major port was a British target, and New Haven formed new companies of militia from remaining householders and Yale students. When night fell on Sunday, July 4th, 1779, a cannon boomed and the signal fire on Beacon Hill was alight. 2 British men of war with more than 40 smaller vessels had come to anchor in New Haven Harbor. After a sleepless night, rebel soldiers mustered on the green and deployed to face invasion at both East and West Haven. Thousands of British soldiers and Marines overwhelmed stiff resistance. By day's end, the town was in enemy hands. What might have been destruction of the town and harbor left New Haven lightly touched. The town had lost 23 lives, 11 houses, 9 barns, and a warehouse were burned. General Garth looked out from the top of the house of Admiral Foote for a bird's eye view and declared that it was too pretty a town to burn. The port's busy trade with the West Indies included a wealth of rum and warehouses discovered by His Majesty's troops, leaving them useless after a jubilant night. General Garth was embarrassed and disheartened, and the night's celebration favored his decision to evacuate and spare the town. Those able trundled their recumbent comrades by cart and barrow to the shore for boarding. A loyalist gentleman in the town hosted a healing banquet that evening for British officers. New Haven slept peacefully and rested for a bon voyage to His Majesty's squadron when it weighed anchor the next morning. Leonard Bacon had been 23 at his inaugural sermon in 1825, a year after graduating from college and seminary. He had paced the green in sleepless hours before he would preside. Daunted in his opening sermon, his diary said, "To be minister here where my efforts ought to have an immediate and mighty bearing on the triumph of the gospel through our land and through the world, oh, it is a fearful thing." Leonard first met Center Church in 1817 when he entered Yale as a sophomore at age 15. Fellow scholars were sons of ministers and substantial families and farm boys grown up with the church. To chapel at daybreak and then to hear what men had to say of Shakespeare and Francis Bacon, Hamlet and Julius Caesar, and life beyond the Bible. Who said what of destiny and how to treat one another? On late nights, friends came together in their rooms for ale and sweet potatoes. Caleb wrote a poem of dialogue between Dr. Silliman, he kind of invented chemistry, and the new theologian whom when they meet in paradise or purgatory, regarding what Jesus would say of electricity. They began a literary journal, The Talebearer, which ran for 30 issues. Late at night, when they departed, he walked the green, New Haven's common. Look up on a clear, cold night and see the creatures of the zodiac circle a world waiting to use and cherish us. At the center of the green, Leonard felt a balance, a counterpoint to his steepled monument of slope. the embattled colony had repulsed the empire. So, now proud and prosperous New Haven was embattled with itself. Now, stocky and bearded in 1858, Leonard heard again the rattle of musket fire as he stood and looked to his church for reassurance. Discord. In his life of preaching, Leonard had departed a repentant land and rowed his craft to a more forgiving shore. On landing, he had the devil of a time calming the conflict in his church. A speaker against slavery, he felt ready to help this older flock to find God's way out of the nation's original sin. They all agreed slavery is sin, but divided on timing abolition and how closely to embrace black people. His wife Lucy saw the troubles in other parishes and held up his confidence as he searched for footing. William Lloyd Garrison founded the Liberator in Boston in January 1, 1831, which said slavery must be abolished now. Leonard Bacon urged moderation. Let the church mediate gradual emancipation. He believed Christian leadership could avert bloodshed, calm the conflict through church speech and writing, all those words upon the waters. His books, including Bacon on Slavery, sermons, articles, pressed for moderation against extreme emotion. Dissenting ripples in his throng sampled the swirl beyond the church. Discord over race and slavery erupted in 1831. To quote, Garrison, Arthur Tappan, and a group of blacks proposed the creation of a college for black males. In June of that year, the first Negro convention held in Philadelphia pledged $20,000 to launch the institution, citing New Haven's friendly, pious, generous, and humane residents, its trade with the West Indies, and its literary and scientific character. The convention endorsed New Haven as the site for the new college. The proposal frightened many whites by involvement of radical abolitionists who called for abolition now and who cared for the sensitivities of Southerners at Yale, the Southern market for New Haven products, and a proposed college which could attract more blacks to their community. Quote, a large number of white New Haveners held a mass meeting at which they condemned the proposal by a vote of 700 to 4 and declared that the college would be resisted by every lawful means. With their excitement stimulated by fiery speeches, an angry mob then shouted obscenities at blacks and stoned Tappan's home, which stood only a few doors from Leonard Bacon's residence. Leonard followed a moderating course and was embattled. Garrison, his harshest critic, charged in 1833 that nowhere in the United States, no slaveholder in the South has uttered or published more excusatory, corrupt, and blasphemous sentiments as regards slavery than Bacon. Leonard was deeply hurt and offended by a personal rebuke from the acerbic Eliza Wright, a childhood friend, they're all preachers, who angrily exhorted him, take my advice and come out like a man, like a true Christian, and confess your sin with up and down honesty against everlasting hair-splitting and equivocation. Leonard clearly looked down on a man like Garrison. In an 1833 article, for example, he suggested because Garrison exhibited deficiencies in framing arguments and discussing principles, he should avoid controversy and employ his talents as a poet to advance the anti-slavery cause. Bacon founded the Journal of Freedom in 1834 for colonization, sent back to Africa. And Garrison suggested it be named the Journal of Despotism.
Wow.
In 1835, Leonard was a founder of the American Union for the Relief and Improvement of the Colored Race, which sought a middle ground through urgent gradualism. An active port and college town, New Haven had its own community of a few hundred free blacks. Leonard sent his children to an integrated school in New Haven and urged other white families to do that. But when action called to support the proposed college for African American males in New Haven or a school for black girls in Canterbury in 1833, he stood aside. Each week's sermon was the ticking of a clock, a deadline to prove his worth to the congregation. And the sermon was a life-sustaining outlet for Leonard to have his one-way conversation with the world, with God, or with whoever cared to listen. He was drawn to controversy where he thought he might ease the pain of discord. William Lloyd Garrison accused Leonard of moral negligence in his failure to make war on slavery. But Leonard took these accusations to confirm his purpose to leave room for Christian empathy and seek peaceful resolution. He retired to his study to write his way through the war of words. His writing could yield coherent substance, something for next Sunday's sermon. Hugh Davis was Leonard's biographer and noted that, quote, perhaps after all, his response to these racial incidents indicates that he was unwilling to jeopardize his standing in Center Church by directly confronting the pervasive racist sentiment among white Americans, or by supporting institutions for black improvement that counted abolitionists among their proponents. William Lloyd Garrison was not far from the mark when he said of men such as Bacon, quote, they are polite men, they are cautious men, they are accommodating men, and they cherish a sacred horror of fanaticism and do not like irritation, and love to sail beneath a cloudless sky upon an unruffled stream. John Brown. In 1857, the parsonage was home to 6 children. Of Leonard and Lucy's, 2 remained in the household. Rebecca, 30, was their firstborn and continued well into adult life as right hand to her mother. Lucy and then to stepmother Catherine after Lucy died in 1844. Rebecca managed the household and care of the younger children. Plain and with authority, she had the confidence and gratitude of Father Leonard. She was strict to make her own life possible. Rebecca's brother, Edward Woolsey Bacon, was 13 and still living at home. The other 4 surviving of the 9 children were grown and out of the home. One evening in 1857, Rebecca heard an insistent knock and hurried to the door, finding an apparition to put the devil in his place with eyes of destiny. Was she in his way? Rebecca curtsied, bade him enter, and hastened to fetch her father. John Brown and Leonard found each other and double-glassed in reverent handshake. Leonard's hand on John's shoulder, they entered the parson's study. The door closed on a current from the past. Carefree in the schoolyard, their boyhood on the Ohio frontier, where 2 lives were shared and then diverged. Brown, the driven wrath of God, and Bacon, beleaguered man of moderation. As storm clouds gathered over slavery, they met again in New Haven in 1857 on February 27th and March 18th. To keep the South in a birthing nation, the founders had agreed to the 3/5 rule. Each slave added 3/5 of a person to the population represented in Congress by their masters. Political power tilted to give a Southern white minority power over the North. Cotton from forced labor was profitable and hungered for more land. Congress passed the Missouri Compromise in 1820, which set a fragile limit on the expansion of slavery. But the Compromise of 1850 repealed the Missouri Compromise, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 imposed expansion of slavery by a white aristocracy in the South on an anti-slavery majority in the nation. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was opposed by a united clergy of thousands from the Northeast, with Bacon in the lead, delivering mass petition signatures to Congress. But Congress passed the act in May 1854, igniting slavery to sunder the nation. The act brought them back together, John and Leonard, annealing the boyhood bond as John and Leonard saw outrage against God's will. Leonard's biography, Hugh Davis, wrote that in the 1856, quote, caning of Charles Sumner in the Senate chamber by a Southern congressman infuriated Northerners even then, more than distant Kansas, as Bacon and his friends saw it as a direct attack on freedom of speech and the Constitution. Leonard delivered keynote speeches at assemblies against the spread of slavery in Kansas. Quote, Rebecca, his daughter, expressed the hope that her father would not take the roof off. As he saw it, the Kansas depredations and the murderous assault on Sumner were mutually reinforcing. Resistance to these and other assaults of the slave interests were necessarily prerequisites not only for a religious awakening, but he implied for something akin to a religious war that would purge the land of the guilt of oppression. He was confident, he noted in a stirring speech in October 1856, welcoming Governor Charles Robeson of Kansas, who was under federal indictment for refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of the pro-slavery legislature, that God's law would ultimately vindicate right and justice in a struggle that might culminate in massive bloodshed. Bacon and other leading men in the community founded the Charles Lyons Colony, which initially consisted of 79 well-armed men. Davis goes on, Bacon addressed several meetings in New Haven in early 1856 that raised funds for people who had chosen to emigrate to Kansas but lacked weapons. At one of these meetings held in North Church, Henry Ward Beecher eloquently appealed for rifles for the Kansas settlers. Bacon fully agreed with Beecher's contention that the free soil forces had the right to arm themselves in self-defense, terming this legitimate Kansas work. Kansas appears to have deepened his frustration and rage, as well as his sense that Americans were engaged in a desperate struggle, which freedom, constitutional rights, God's laws were at stake. Lincoln's predecessors had moved many of the nation's better weapons to arsenals in the South. When John Brown captured the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, October 19, 1859, Leonard saw it as an act of a madman, but of one made mad by the outrage of Southern oppression, an act of providence. His assault on Harper's Ferry caused some to call him crazy, but many soon joined his purpose. John became hero and martyr and led them into Battle Hymn of the Republic. Last paragraph here. Reveille. Aunt Alice Mabel Bacon was born February 26, 1858, in the white clapboard house on Church Street, the last of Leonard's 14 children. She was a year and a half when Leonard's sister, her Aunt Delia, returned from England to final sanctuary at the Hartford Retreat. Unmoved by slavery, when Delia died in September 1859, she yielded the family center stage to the parting of the country. Righteousness simmered north and south, dissolving clouds of doubt toward certainty of evil in the other. The Bacon household drifted toward action that, just the day before, had been unthinkable. Soon the men would take up uniform. Lincoln's election as president declared commitment of the North against slavery. At 3 years old, Alice was alert and her dark eyes took in the world. She felt excitement and dread from the grown-up holding her when she looked out the parsonage window at the regiment of 2nd Connecticut Volunteers as it was assembled and christened on the green. The Woolsey family of New York City were friends with the Bacons and shared letters. Georgiana Woolsey and her sister Eliza became nurses for the Union Army. They assembled a record after the war called Letters of a Family during the War for the Union. Its introduction tells us, in the spring of 1859, Abby, not having been very well during the winter, Mother planned a little trip to the South for her benefit, making up a party with Robert, Mary, and little Mary. They spent several days in Charleston and vexed their righteous souls with the sights and sounds of an auction of slaves. As such, Letters from the War were Alice's school book for 4 years from her ages 3 to 7. That's it.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, Bob, you have brought us
Thank you.
some important history. You have given some phrases like extreme
Well,
and moderation in
yeah,
the
yeah,
same-
urgent gradualism. Yeah,
urgent
that was the solution,
gradualism.
right.
That's what I wish
Keep
I had
talking,
had my
keep writing.
yeah, urgent gradualism. Bob, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, and look forward to more Writers Read. We have some planned for each month. So thanks to all of you who are writing and sharing. It's a good part of this community, one of the many good parts of this community. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.